On December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. It was the second largest world economy at the time, and the largest country in the world. What did it take for this giant to fall? Beginning in 1914, the First World War had begun, and Tsar Nicholas II led Russia into it. This war was very costly for Russian peasants, and many died over the course of the war. Then in 1917, women began to riot and protest. This protest began shortly after an increase in bread prices. The escalation of this protest forced Tsar Nicholas II to step down, abdicating his throne and ending the Romanov dynasty. This is the February Revolution, which took place on International Women's Day. In the West, International Women's Day is celebrated on March 8th. On Russian calendars at the time, that was February 23rd. The new government's Provisional Committee then decided the official celebration of the Great Day of Russian Revolution to be the 27th, as a celebration of the forming of their own committee. This highlighted their political maneuvering rather than the protests started by women suffragists. A prime minister was also appointed by the same Provisional Committee, and quickly overthrown by the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin. This revolution in the same year is known as the October Revolution. Lenin, as the leader of the party, appealed to feminism to make labor more appealing, and to increase the already growing amount of women in the workforce. Very influential communist feminists at the time, Alexandra Kollontai, urged women to actively support communism. She's quoted to say, "For many centuries, woman was oppressed and had no rights. For many centuries, she was just an appendage to the man, his shadow. The husband provided for his wife so long as she obeyed her husband's will, meekly endured her own powerlessness, her own domestic and family slavery." In 1918, Lenin signed a truce with Germany. He then nationalized factories and farms and also outlawed churches. Churches and cathedrals would be stolen or repurposed casually by the state. Religious persecution became foundational as the Soviet states seemed to directly compete with any other higher power. In the same year, Tsar Nicholas and his family were assassinated by Bolshevik secret police. And a civil war began in Russia, again, this time whites, not Bolsheviks, and reds, Bolsheviks. Then in 1921, the civil war would end. The Bolsheviks, now called communists, had won. Millions of people had died from starvation. The city of Petrograd had gone from 2.5 million to about 500,000 residents in 3 years. In 22, the Soviet Union was created, including Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. In 24, Lenin would die and would be replaced by Stalin. Then, in 27, Stalin would launch a campaign to destroy Islam in the USSR. In 29, he would implement the policy of dekulakization. A kulak represented a greedy and unfair property owner, but in practice could be anyone with property. Stalin praised higher grain quotas and moved the resource out of Ukraine on trains. The forced collectivization and increased grain quotas led to the deaths of millions of Ukrainians. This famine is regarded as intentional, designed to stop Ukrainian independence. Knowledge of Holodomor was suppressed in Soviet media. Many did not know what was happening in the world domestically or abroad. Then in 34, the Great Purge would begin. 2.5 million arrests were made, and 700,000 executions. Then the Second World War would begin in 39. In 40, the Soviet Union would occupy and absorb Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. In 41, the German siege of Leningrad would begin for 872 days. In 45, the Soviet Union would capture Berlin and defeat the Nazis. In 49, the Soviets used their first atomic bomb. In 53, Stalin would die and be succeeded by Georgy Malenkov. In 55, Malenkov would sign the Warsaw Pact. In 57, the first satellite would be launched, Sputnik. In 58, Khrushchev would succeed Malenkov, and China would fall out with Russia. And in 1961, Yuri Gagarin would be the first man in space. In 1964, Khrushchev would be replaced by Brezhnev. In 1982, Brezhnev would die, being replaced by the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov. In 1984, Andropov died and would be replaced with Chernenko. In 1985, Chernenko died and was replaced by Gorbachev. Gorbachev would begin an anti-alcohol campaign and the policies known as glasnost and perestroika, or openness and restructuring. Then in 1986, the Chernobyl incident would occur. In 1989, Soviet regimes would begin to topple. Then in 1991, a coup would take place. Tanks would drive down the streets of Moscow. Pushkin Square would be filled with soldiers and residents of the city. Later that year, Gorbachev would resign as president, and the Soviet Union would fall. As to what we can learn from the USSR, I will focus on a few topics, namely media suppression and food insecurity. Today there are still issues regarding media suppression in the forms of assassination and imprisonment. As of July 2024, 33 journalists are being detained in Russia, many of whom had closed trials. Some were jailed for crimes like lying about the Russian army. Journalists haven't been wrongfully imprisoned like this since the Cold War. At least 58 journalists have been murdered in Russia since 1992. With 5 people held responsible for murders in these cases, many of these cases have gone on uninvestigated. I'd like to point out another theme of food insecurity which was built in at the foundation of the Soviet Union. It's concerning that the current president of Russia seems to take some of his style from Soviet leaders of old. Now, while agricultural industries around the world are teetering on the edge of chaos, the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues. If Russia is able to grab more and more of Ukrainian farmland, then more of the world would be reliant on Russian exports of grain and more vulnerable to strategic use of famine. Historically, I think Ukrainians have suffered these famines during the period of Holodomor, and Russia's claim on their territory may indenture the people of Ukraine to Russia yet again. I'd also like to address the many negative characterizations of the place and people who made up the eastern side of the Iron Curtain. American news and popular media rarely releases positive stories about post-Soviet countries. There's a long rivalry of capitalism and communism, an effort to pose American people and values as being opposite from Soviet or Eastern European. Both sides of this dichotomy believe they are the cure for the other's illness. These kinds of prejudices aren't very nuanced. I try to look back to the era of the USSR.